In this lecture, we undertake the ambitious project of looking into economic history from the early modern period to the present day. That means we will address no less than 500 years of economic change, political confrontation, global interdependence and competition. Our focus will lay especially on the following three perspectives. First, the question of the specific types of entrepreneurs, what were the driving forces and what distinguished them. Second, the emergence of markets and their development. Hereby we are also interested in the role of the state and statehood. And third, we focus on the emergence of different types of enterprises and how they were managed and accumulated capital. And here too, what was their relationship to the state. One of the characteristics of the early modern period is the expansion of European influence across the globe, represented not least by the expeditions of Christoph Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And it was the early modern period which saw the beginnings of the modern European empires and with them the expropriation of land and resources. However, Europe was not one united player in this process. The European states competed and chose different solutions to gain access to the distant markets overseas. Given the religious conflicts in the Mediterranean, the spice routes were practically blocked for the Christian powers. The Portuguese expeditionaries therefore established enclaves in the Gulf of Guinea that functioned as important centers for the slave trade and from which they had access to the Atlantic trade routes. After Vasco da Gama's expedition, this was finally also the case for the Indian Ocean. And at the same time, the Portuguese expansion to Brazil and the exploitation of sugar plantations began. Especially in Asia, the Portuguese were able to gain an advantage, and from 1543 they were even trading with the Japanese Empire. The Portuguese supremacy in African, Indian and Asian waters prompted strong competition with the Spanish crown of Castile. Both signed treaties regulating their competing claims for their expansion ambitions, and the result was an Iberian mare clausum. When Portugal was integrated into the Castilian monarchy in 1580, a huge empire was created with dominions in all four parts of the world. After Columbus' arrival in America in 1492, a booming Atlantic traffic of goods and people developed. And in an attempt to regulate this traffic, the Spanish established the Casa de la Contratación in 1503. This was an institution based in the city of Seville, which had the only port approved for imports and exports going overseas. It supervised the arrival of ships from the Americas as well as the supply of leaving ships. In short, the institution monopolized the Spanish Atlantic trade. In 1717, the headquarters were moved to Cadiz. But the reforms of Charles III and his policies to liberalize trade with the Americas at the end of the 18th century increasingly weakened the mercantile strengths of the Casa de la Contratación. For centuries, the strongest competitors of the Iberian empires were England and the Republic of the Netherlands. At the end of the 16th century, expeditions to the Far East started from various Dutch cities, and in 1602 the Dutch East India Company was founded. It followed the Iberian examples as it was also granted significant monopoly privileges. However, an important difference was that it was financed through joint stock financing. The recruitment of private investors was extremely successful, and at the same time the company was closely linked to the Dutch state, which took aggressive action in the Far East. Portuguese bases were conquered, and for example the inhabitants of the Banda Islands were almost exterminated. In England, the ties between the Crown and the English East India Company were less close than in the Netherlands. The English East India Company was initially financed on a voyage-by-voyage basis, with investors receiving a share of the profits when they returned. A permanent joint stock company was not established until the 1650s. This difference also had the implication of a less aggressive trading strategy than the Dutch. Instead of military enterprises to control production in Asia, the English followed a strategy of buying cheap in Asia and selling expensive in Europe. It was not until the second half of the 17th century that a territorial English power established in India. The mentioned stock corporations were important forerunners of modern business enterprises. At the same time, these company states performed tasks that were quite unlike modern corporations. They were granted governmental rights, including the authority to wage war against non-Europeans, and this was a sign of their origin in a Europe characterized by hybrid sovereignty, which could be deployed creatively in Asia. In addition, the innovation of new forms of business organization were often linked to Europe's global interactions and the intra-European competition. European rulers respected private property rights at home, but their expeditions overseas were accompanied by expropriation. European states used violence to infringe on each other's monopolies and did so in alliance with private actors. During the 19th century, the operation of the economy changed fundamentally in Europe. Merchant capitalism was replaced by industrial capitalism, comprising large-scale use of the factory system, expansion of mass production, widespread use of wage labor, and worldwide networks of markets. Instead of the traditional economic framework of guilds and serfdom, free competition prevailed as a general principle. Liberalization and industrialization are regarded as the prominent aspects of economic change in Europe's 19th century. At the same time, they point to the great divergence of the continent in this process. While steam engines were already used in large factories in the textile industries of northwest England around 1800, a remote village in the Bavarian Alps could remain untouched by them even 100 years later. European economic history in the 19th century is characterized by the coexistence of industrialization and rural stagnation, of market economy and state intervention, of prosperity for some and poverty for many. Deregulation of land ownership and the abolition of serfdom allowed a freer circulation of capital and labor, resulting in a rapidly expanding market economy. Farmers began to withdraw from subsistence farming, and a new working class also emerged in Europe's new industrial centers. Formations such as the German Customs Union, signed in 1833, and numerous free trade agreements such as the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty between Great Britain and France, signed in 1860, contributed to a tremendous increase in international trade. However, the era of international trade liberalization did not last long. By the end of the century, protectionism was on the rise again. Once again, it is important to point out that the implementation of liberal principles in Europe varied in degree and speed. While Great Britain, France and Belgium were forerunners with Prussia as follow-up, for example, the great empires of Austria-Hungary, Russia and the Ottomans, for example, were slower in this process. Not to be underestimated is also the role of geography in this industrialization process. Natural resources, such as the coal fields in Upper Silesia or the fertile black soil in the southern steppes of the Tsarist Empire, shaped economic opportunities. In addition, coastal and river ports were now able to exploit their advantageous position as European or even global trading hubs, with the effect that entirely new economic centers emerged in locations such as Trieste or Odessa. Cities like Liverpool, Le Havre and Antwerp connected the imperial centers with the global colonies and the emerging world market. In many ways, the modern state played a central role in these processes of industrialization and marketization. The state provided the infrastructure which was needed, for example, for the exploitation of natural resources. The state financed investments in the railroad and the telegraph infrastructure, and the state played a crucial role in promoting scientific research as well. Technical and commercial colleges and universities promoted innovation and educated engineers. While the first stage of industrialization was mainly about coal and steel, this was followed by later innovations in the electrical, chemical, or automotive industries. Let's take a look at the inner structure of the companies. In fact, the economic transformations of the 19th centuries were mainly led by family businesses. Institutionally, the modern joint stock company emerged only later in the century. This was then made possible because the unlimited liability of collective partnerships was replaced by methods in which the liability of each shareholder was limited to the own invested capital. The growing modern companies were dependent on private capital, so merchants and businessmen also founded new institutions, banking corporations, which combined commercial and business banking. It was the birth of the modern banking system. In the last quarter of the 19th century, economic competition became far more intense because prices fell and the profit margins decreased. And, as already mentioned, tariff barriers also began to rise again with stronger protectionism. This situation of tough international competition and the capital-intensive character of many commercial sectors made it difficult or impossible for new companies to be established. The result was an increasingly oligopolistic industrial and business structure. While periodization into a long 19th century, from the French Revolution in 1789 to World War I in 1914, and a short 20th century until the end of the Cold War in 1989, has become generally accepted in the historical studies, the case of economic history is a bit more difficult in this respect. That is because economic cycles do not always overlap with political developments. So let's take a look at a few major economic events. The stock market crash of 1873 resulted in a strong economic depression in the United States, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, and Great Britain. The Great Depression of 1929 topped this crisis and did not subside until the preparations of World War II. The following decades of economic growth were then finally interrupted by the so-called oil crisis of 1973, again causing a worldwide depression. The last crisis of such scale was the collapse of the US mortgage market in 2008. All these events shape the developments of the modern European economy and can therefore provide good indications for periodization of economic history. And of course, the First and Second World Wars, the Cold War and its end had enormous transformative impact on the economic development. We should take a look at the structural organization of companies in this time period too. Which corporate form was the dominating in Europe's modern economic history? The modern management company did not become the dominant business form until after the Second World War, and initially mainly in North America, where markets were far away from their suppliers. In Europe, the situation was different at first because the nation-state system did not allow the establishment of a single market as in the United States. The markets were territorially fragmented and the consumers also not so far away from the producers. Therefore, there was no need for a manufacturing firm to control the sales of its own products or to integrate the productive and commercial functions. Even today, family businesses are much more widespread in Europe than in the United States. It cannot surprise that the Second World War and its consequences also changed the economy and markets in Western Europe substantially. Many historians claim they became more American. In fact, American consumer goods became very popular in Europe, and many production and marketing techniques were adopted. The orientation towards the American model became manifested in particular by the European Recovery Program. This program, better known as the Marshall Plan, George C. Marshall was at that time the American Secretary of State, was an economic aid program that lasted from 1948 to 51. It was worth a proud 12.4 billion US dollars. Its distinctive feature was that it was not a loan, meaning that the signing Western European countries did not have to pay back the money. But the benefiting states were obligated to rebuild their economies and financial systems along American lines. In addition, the countries were committed to close cooperation with the United States in terms of financial and trade flows. But it was not only the external impetus of the Marshall Plan that drove the integration of the Western European economies. In 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community was founded, and with the Treaty of Paris, the signing states, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the Federal Republic of Germany decided to regulate their coal and steel industries together. The consequence was mainly a deeper integration of the European market, which was continued with the establishment of the European Economic Community and the Treaties of Rome in 1957. Today, the European single market includes 27 member states, and the euro is right now in use in 19 European countries. In Eastern Europe, economic development took a quite different course than it did in Western Europe. During the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 22, the Bolshevik revolutionaries established a system of the so-called war communism. The system was characterized by overwhelming power of the state. For example, a labor duty was imposed and private enterprises were banned. However, the experiment of war communism failed, mainly lacking the support of the peasants who were not fully integrated into the national market system. And the productivity was also too low to ensure the necessary supply. To address the looming food crisis and push for the rapid industrialization of the country, the Soviet government introduced collectivization. This was a policy that, for example, in Kazakhstan, forced nomads to settle as peasants. And, for example, in Ukraine, peasants had to give up their individually used farms and join large collective units instead. Such measures repeatedly led to severe famines that probably cost the lives of more than 1.5 million people. The collectivization went hand in hand with measures to push forward industrialization. In 1928, the first five-year plan was finally introduced. In the command economy system, economic plans were de jure laws and their non-fulfillment therefore illegal. The system was extended to the economies of the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe after World War II, until it collapsed together with the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in 1989 to 91. Already by the 1960s, it was clear that the production capacity was not strong enough to meet the public demand and to compete with Western European economies and the United States. Looking at the role of entrepreneurs, companies and markets in the economic long 20th century, it can be summarized that the developments were characterized by globalization, as well as by localization or regional processes of differentiation. This applies regarding the planned economies in Eastern Europe as well as the market economies in Western Europe, but also the many regional differences on both sides of the Iron Curtain are worth being looked at in a differentiated way. The capitalist economies were by far not uniform, and the socialist or planned approaches were diverse in the various countries of Eastern Europe. After the end of the Cold War and the transformation of former planned economies into new market companies, the European economic relations and markets became more interdependent and consolidated, especially in the context of the European single market. But recurring economic crises show that instability still exists, which makes political cooperation even more essential. Let's take at the end of this lecture again a look at our ride through 500 years of economic history. We started with the Spanish and Portuguese in the 16th century, who tried hard to secure their overseas possessions and profits because the pressure on the Iberian monopoly was quite strong. Eventually, new types of corporations emerged in the Netherlands and in England, stimulating the intra-European competition for global leadership. The new forms of joint stock companies were forerunners of modern businesses and important innovations in global entrepreneurship. At the same time, it becomes clear that there were major differences from the later purely private corporate organization. For example, when you think of the military and political functions of the English East Indian Company. What we have seen in this competition between the Iberians, the Netherlands and England is that there was an increasing divergence between the south and the north of Europe. However, it is important to emphasize that this divergence was not in contradiction with processes of integration at the same time. Let's jump to the 19th century, the age of industrial capitalism across Europe. Traditional elements of commercial life, such as guilds, were disappearing and were replaced by modern capitalist institutions, for example, modern joint stock companies. In addition, the first wave of modern globalization began during this period. And however, despite the globalizing economy and the development of big business, family-owned businesses continued to be key players in the European economy. In the 20th century, the development of entrepreneurs, companies and markets was characterized by both globalization and localization, meaning processes of regional diversification. The most visible economic divides were certainly between the command economies in Eastern and Southeastern Europe and the market economies in Western, Northern and Southern Europe. Both socialist and capitalist economies struggled with recurring economic crises at the regional, national and international levels. The European integration and the creation of the single European market were, in turn, supposed to promote more stable economic relations between the European economies. After the end of the Cold War, European markets became even more interdependent. But it is not only the economic and financial crises that show the vulnerability of the European economy. Today, new pandemic, political and military crises are emerging that have also massive economic consequences. And what this means for the economic political architecture of Europe, only the future will show.